I never expected to inherit anything from my great Uncle George. We barely spoke during family gatherings, and he seemed like a gruff old man who preferred the company of his chickens to people. The last time I had any meaningful interaction with him was when I was 10 years old, nearly 22 years ago. He'd shown me his old John Deere tractor, patiently explaining how the engine worked while I handed him tools from a weathered red toolbox. "Remember, Alex," he'd said in that gravelly voice of his, "the real value of things isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes what looks worthless to most people is priceless to those who understand what they're looking at." At the time, his words had gone right over my head. I was just a kid fascinated by the massive green machine and the way Uncle George's calloused hands seemed to know exactly how to coax life back into metal parts. Before I left that day, he'd given me a small, oddly shaped piece of metal, something he'd fashioned himself from scrap. "Keep this," he'd said. "One day you might understand why machinery matters more than people think." I'd kept that metal piece all these years, carrying it like a lucky charm, even though I couldn't say exactly why. Maybe because it was the only real connection I had to a man who was blood, but might as well have been a stranger. So when the call came from a lawyer named Samuel Hodges informing me that George had left me his entire farm, I was stunned into silence. The property sat on 50 acres of what used to be prime farmland in western Pennsylvania. Though it had been neglected for years, according to Mr. Hodges, the house needed work, the barn was falling apart, and scattered around the yard were pieces of old farm equipment that probably hadn't run since the Carter administration. "There's something else you should know, Mr. Morgan," the lawyer had added. "Your uncle modified his will just 3 months before his passing. He was quite specific that the property should go to you and no one else." That detail struck me as odd. Why would George suddenly decide to leave everything to me? We hadn't spoken in years. I'd sent Christmas cards, received the occasional birthday check when I was younger, but there was no close relationship there. It made no sense. I was 32 years old, recently laid off from my job as a mechanical engineer, when the manufacturing plant I worked for closed down. 6 years of college had left me with crippling student loan debt, and the end of a 5-year relationship meant I was now shouldering the rent on my apartment alone. The timing of this inheritance couldn't have been better, even if it came wrapped in the confusion of George's unexpected death. I drove out to the farm on a Saturday morning, keys jangling in my pocket, unsure what I was going to do with the place. The real estate market was decent, and I figured I could probably sell it, use the money to pay off my student loans, and maybe put a down payment on a smaller place. A fresh start. The 2-hour drive from Pittsburgh took me through increasingly rural landscapes until I turned onto a gravel road that led to George's farm. As I pulled up to the weathered 2-story farmhouse, I was struck by how peaceful it looked despite its state of disrepair. Morning light filtered through ancient oak trees, casting dappled shadows across the yard. The air smelled clean in a way city air never does, filled with the scent of grass and earth. I got out of my car and just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The house needed a new roof and a coat of paint, but its bones looked solid. The red barn leaned slightly to one side, its once bright paint faded to a rusty hue. Farm equipment in various states of decay dotted the property like sleeping metal beasts. And there, under a massive oak tree, sat the old John Deere tractor I remembered from my childhood visit, now covered in rust and weeds. Something about the place spoke to me. Maybe it was the way the land rolled gently away from the house, creating a natural viewpoint over the surrounding countryside. Maybe it was the quiet that was punctuated only by birdsong and the rustling of leaves. Whatever it was, I found myself surprisingly reluctant to immediately call a real estate agent. As I walked toward the house, the screen door opened, and an elderly Asian woman stepped onto the porch. She was small but straight-backed, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a neat bun. Her weathered face suggested she was in her mid-60s, but her movements were spry and purposeful. "You must be Alex," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I'm Susan Chen. I looked after your uncle for the past 30 years. I shook her hand, surprised by the strength of her grip. "I didn't know Uncle George had help around the place." "Not help, friend," Susan corrected with a slight smile. George was not the type of man who admitted he needed help, even when he did. "I came 3 times a week to cook, clean, and make sure he hadn't fallen and broken his stubborn neck." I liked her immediately. There was a directness to her manner that was refreshing. "Did you know he left me the farm?" I asked. Susan nodded. "He told me. Come inside. I've made coffee. The house is yours now, but I took the liberty of tidying up before you arrived." The interior of the farmhouse was surprisingly well maintained compared to the exterior. Wide plank floors had been recently polished, and though the furniture was old, it was clean and sturdy. The kitchen had been modernized at some point in the 1990s, with solid if dated appliances. Susan poured coffee into two thick mugs and gestured for me to sit at a large oak table that looked like it had hosted a century of family meals. "George was a complicated man," she said as she joined me. "Not good at showing affection or explaining himself. But he kept track of you over the years." This surprised me. "He did?" Susan rose and went to a drawer, pulling out a folder. Inside were newspaper clippings about engineering competitions I'd won in college, a copy of my graduation announcement, even a printout of an article from an industry magazine that had mentioned a pump design I'd helped develop. I was stunned. George had been following my career from a distance all this time without ever reaching out. "Why didn't he ever contact me?" I asked. Susan shrugged. "Pride, perhaps, or fear of rejection. By the time he realized he wanted a relationship with his family, he'd spent so many years pushing everyone away that he didn't know how to bridge that gap." I spent the morning exploring the house with Susan as my guide. George had been an engineer before becoming a farmer, she explained, which accounted for the numerous modifications throughout the property. He'd designed his own heating system, installed an ingenious water filtration setup, and modified most of the farm equipment to suit his specific needs. "He was brilliant," Susan said, "but not good with people. Machines were easier for him to understand." After lunch, Susan mentioned she needed to leave for a doctor's appointment, but would return the next day if I was planning to stay overnight. I told her I'd brought a sleeping bag just in case and would likely spend at least one night to get a feel for the place. As Susan was preparing to leave, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. A lean, weathered man in his early 60s got out and approached the house. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt, despite the warm spring day. His face was tanned and creased from years of outdoor work, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. "You must be Harold's great-nephew," he said, extending a hand. "Frank Miller. I've been farming the land next door for nearly 30 years." We shook hands and made small talk about the property. Frank seemed knowledgeable about the farm and friendly enough, though I noticed Susan's expression had cooled considerably when he arrived. She excused herself shortly after, giving me a meaningful look that I couldn't quite interpret. Frank offered to show me around the property line, pointing out where George's land ended and his began. As we walked, he made casual conversation about farming challenges, property values, and the changing nature of rural communities. He seemed to be sizing me up, trying to figure out what kind of person I was and what I planned to do with George's farm. After showing me various landmarks and property features, Frank's demeanor shifted slightly. He got that look people get when they're about to make a business proposition. "Listen," he said, kicking at a clump of dirt. "I've been thinking about expanding my operation for a while now. Your uncle's land would be perfect for what I have in mind. I'd be willing to make you a fair offer for the whole property, save you the trouble of dealing with all this." He gestured broadly at the dilapidated outbuildings and overgrown fields. I told him I appreciated the offer but needed time to think things through. I was still processing the fact that I owned 50 acres of land, let alone deciding what to do with it. "Of course, take your time," Frank said, but then he pointed toward the old John Deere tractor I'd noticed earlier. "But let me throw in something extra to sweeten the deal. See that old tractor over there? That thing's been sitting there for at least 15 years. Engines seized, tires are rotted, transmissions shot. It's basically scrap metal at this point." I looked over at the tractor. It was indeed in rough shape, with weeds growing up around the wheels and rust eating away at every exposed metal surface. But something in my engineer's brain recognized it as a John Deere 4020, a model that had been considered the gold standard of tractors in its day. "Take the tractor. It's worthless," Frank continued with a laugh. "I'll have it hauled off your property for free as part of the deal. Save you the trouble and expense of getting rid of it yourself. What do you say?" There was something about the way he said it that struck me as odd. Maybe he was too enthusiastic, Or maybe he was trying a little too hard to convince me the tractor was worthless. My father, who taught me everything I knew about engines before he passed away, always said, when someone's trying to tell you something has no value, that's exactly when you should take a closer look. I told Frank I'd consider his offer and get back to him in a few days. As he drove away, I couldn't help but notice how his gaze lingered on the old tractor, something almost like hunger in his expression. That afternoon, I found myself walking back over to the John Deere. Up close, it was even more deteriorated than it had appeared from a distance. The green paint had faded and peeled away, leaving patches of bare metal that had rusted to a deep orange-brown. The seat was cracked and splitting, with stuffing poking out like cotton from an old pillow. I ran my hand along the hood, my mind automatically cataloging what would be needed to restore it. New tires, obviously, engine rebuild, transmission work, hydraulics. It would be a massive undertaking, but I couldn't deny the challenge appealed to the engineer in me. I tried to open the hood to look at the engine, but the latch was rusted shut. The doors to the cab were similarly stuck. Everything about this machine screamed abandonment and neglect. But still, Frank's eagerness to dismiss it as worthless had planted a seed of curiosity in my mind. I walked back to my car and grabbed my toolbox. If nothing else, I could at least take a look at what I was dealing with before making any decisions about Frank's offer. The latch finally gave way after liberal application of WD-40 and some gentle persuasion with a hammer. When I lifted the hood, I was surprised by what I found. Yes, the engine was obviously seized and covered in rust, but everything was still there. No parts had been stripped, which was unusual for farm equipment that had sat neglected for so long. In many cases, parts alone from these old tractors could be worth hundreds of dollars to collectors and restorers. I worked my way methodically around the tractor, checking various components. The cab door took more effort to open, but eventually I managed to pry it apart. The interior was a mess of torn upholstery and rusted metal, but again, I could see that the bones of a quality machine were still there. Something was odd, though. Looking more closely at some of the modifications, I realized they weren't the result of neglect or damage. They were intentional changes made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The fuel tank in particular had been modified in a way that seemed unnecessary for normal operation. I suddenly remembered the small metal piece George had given me all those years ago. On a hunch, I pulled out my keychain, where I still carried it. The piece was about 3 inches long, an odd asymmetrical shape with a small hook at one end. I'd always assumed it was just a piece of scrap that George had fashioned into an impromptu gift for a child, but now I wondered if it might have a specific purpose. I climbed up to examine the fuel tank more closely. It was located under the seat, and accessing it required removing several rusted bolts. The work was slow going with my limited tools, but my curiosity was piqued. When I finally got the access panel off and peered into the fuel tank, I expected to find either empty space or old, gummed-up gasoline. What I found instead made me sit back on my heels in surprise. The tank wasn't empty, and it wasn't full of old gas either. Instead, there was something wrapped in what looked like oiled canvas or waterproof material, something that definitely wasn't supposed to be in a fuel tank. My heart started beating faster as I realized I might have stumbled onto something significant. I carefully extracted the package, which was heavier than I expected. It was about the size of a shoebox but flatter, wrapped in what felt like canvas that had been treated with oil or wax to make it waterproof. I carried it over to a clean workbench I'd seen in the barn and carefully untied the cord that held the wrapping closed. As I peeled back the layers of protective material, my breath caught in my throat. Inside were stacks of bills. Not just any bills, but crisp, clean currency that looked like it had been stored in a bank vault. Most of it was in hundreds, but there were also 50s and 20s, all bound with rubber bands that had somehow survived decades of storage. I sat there staring at the money, trying to process what I was seeing. There had to be thousands of dollars here, maybe tens of thousands. But that wasn't even the most interesting part. Mixed in with the more common bills were notes that I didn't immediately recognize. They looked older, with different designs and what appeared to be higher denominations. Some were clearly from decades past, and others looked like they might be even older than that. I carefully separated the money into different piles, trying to get a sense of what I was dealing with. The newer bills alone added up to nearly $30,000, but it was the older currency that really caught my attention. I wasn't an expert on collectible money, but I knew enough to recognize that some of these bills might be worth considerably more than their face value. There were also some papers tucked in with the money. They appeared to be documents of some kind, though they were written in a spidery handwriting that would require careful study to decipher. One page had what looked like a crude map of the farm, with several locations marked with small X's. As I sat in that old barn, surrounded by stacks of money that had been hidden for who knows how long, I began to understand why Frank Miller had been so eager to haul away that worthless tractor. Somehow he must have known about this cash, or at least suspected it existed. The question was, what else did he know that I didn't? I carefully rewrapped everything and locked it in my car before continuing to explore the property. The barn was in rough shape, but structurally sound. The house had good bones despite needing cosmetic work, and scattered around the yard were tools and equipment that, while old, might still have some value. As the sun started to set, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sell to Frank just yet, at least not until I understood exactly what I was inheriting. And that included getting a better look at those documents and figuring out if there were other caches hidden around the property. I was about to head back to the house when I noticed a patrol car pulling into the driveway. A woman in a sheriff's uniform stepped out and approached me with a confident stride. She was in her mid-40s, with streaks of gray in her dark brown hair and the watchful eyes of someone who didn't miss much. "Alex Morgan?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Sheriff Beth Reynolds. Just wanted to stop by and introduce myself. We don't get many new faces around here, especially ones inheriting property." We shook hands, and I couldn't help but notice how she scanned the property as we talked, her gaze lingering on the old tractor and the barn where I'd been working. "How'd you know I was here?" I asked. "Small town," she said with a slight smile. "Word travels fast. Susan mentioned George's nephew had arrived to check out the inheritance. Thought I'd stop by, see if you needed anything." "That's neighborly of you," I said, not entirely convinced that was her only reason for visiting. "George was well respected around here," she continued. "Kept to himself, but always paid his taxes on time and never caused trouble. People have been wondering what would happen to this place since he passed." "I'm still figuring that out myself," I admitted. Sheriff Reynolds nodded. "Take your time. But a word of advice? There are folks around here who've had their eye on this property for years. Some might try to take advantage of the fact that you're not from around here. Be careful who you trust." Before I could ask her to elaborate, her radio crackled with a call. She excused herself but paused before getting back in her car. "One more thing," she said. "There have been rumors for years about George having hidden assets around the property. Probably just small-town gossip, but, well, if you find anything interesting, you might want to keep it to yourself until you figure out what you're dealing with." With that cryptic warning, she drove away, leaving me with more questions than answers. First Frank's unusual interest in the worthless tractor, and now the sheriff dropping by with vague warnings about hidden assets and people not to trust. What exactly had I inherited here? I spent the night in the farmhouse, sleeping fitfully on the old but surprisingly comfortable bed in what had been George's room. The house creaked and settled around me, but there was something oddly comforting about the sounds. I dreamed of my father and Uncle George, working together on an engine while I watched, trying to understand what they were doing. Early the next morning, I was awakened by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I looked out the window to see Susan arriving with what appeared to be grocery bags. By the time I dressed and made my way downstairs, she had coffee brewing and was unpacking eggs and bacon. "I thought you might be hungry," she said by way of greeting, "and we need to talk." Over breakfast, I told Susan about finding the money in the tractor's fuel tank and about Frank's odd interest in hauling away the worthless machine. Her expression darkened as I spoke. "Frank Miller worked for your uncle many years ago," she said when I finished. "George fired him after money went missing from the business accounts. Frank always insisted he was innocent, but George never believed him." "You think Frank knew about the money in the tractor?" I asked. "I think Frank has suspected for years that George hid assets around the property," Susan replied. "George was cautious with his money, didn't trust banks much, and he definitely didn't trust Frank Miller, even before the missing money incident." I pulled out the crude map I'd found with the cash. "Any idea what these marks might indicate?" Susan studied it, then nodded slowly. These look like the various outbuildings on the property. See, this would be the chicken coop, this the old well house, this the storage shed by the north field. Places where George might have hidden more surprises, I suggested. Possibly. Susan hesitated, then continued. There's something else you should know. George wasn't just a farmer. Before he bought this place, he was an engineer for a defense contractor. Worked on classified projects in the 1960s and early 70s. He left suddenly, bought this farm, and never spoke about his previous work. This new information cast George in an entirely different light. Not just a reclusive farmer, but a man with a mysterious past tied to government work during the Cold War. I thought about the money, the map, the modifications to the tractor that were far more sophisticated than they needed to be. Did he ever mention why he left his engineering career? I asked. Susan shook her head. He was a private man, but I do know he kept in touch with some people from that time. Received letters occasionally that he'd read and then burn. And about twice a year, he'd lock himself in his study for days, working on something he never discussed. After breakfast, I decided to check out the chicken coop, which was marked on the map with an X. The small wooden structure was dilapidated, with several boards missing and the roof partially collapsed. It clearly hadn't housed chickens for years. Inside, I found the expected mess of old nesting boxes and chicken wire. But as I examined the dirt floor more carefully, I noticed one section where the earth looked different, more compacted than the surrounding areas. Using a shovel I'd found in the barn, I began to dig. About 2 feet down, my shovel struck something solid. Clearing away more dirt revealed a metal box, similar in size to an ammunition container, painted to blend with the soil. I pried it open to find another waterproof package inside, this one containing more cash along with what appeared to be gold coins and some jewelry. There was also a leather-bound journal filled with entries in the same spidery handwriting as the documents I'd found with the first cache. I flipped through it, noting dates from the early 1970s. George had apparently been documenting something systematically over years, though a quick scan suggested it was in some kind of personal code. I was so absorbed in examining the journal that I didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across the doorway of the chicken coop. I looked up to see Frank Miller standing there, his expression unreadable. "Finding anything interesting?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes fixed on the metal box at my feet. I quickly closed the journal and stood up. Just getting a feel for the property. A lot of work needed to get it back in shape. Frank nodded, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. "Thought any more about my offer?" "Still considering my options," I said. "It's a big decision." Sure. Frank took a step into the chicken coop, his gaze sweeping over the disturbed earth and the metal box. "You know, I could help you clean up around here. I've got equipment, manpower. Could save you a lot of trouble." "I appreciate that," I said, moving to block his view of the box. "But I think I need to spend some time here first, get a better understanding of what I'm dealing with." Frank's friendly demeanor slipped just slightly, a flash of something harder showing through. "Well, don't wait too long. Property like this, unattended, can attract the wrong kind of attention. Would hate to see anything happen to your inheritance." The implied threat wasn't subtle. I maintained a neutral expression, but inside my mind was racing. Frank knew something about George's hidden assets, maybe even more than I did at this point, and he was clearly willing to go to considerable lengths to get his hands on them. After Frank left, I quickly reburied the metal box in a different location and marked it on my own copy of the map. I needed to figure out exactly what I was dealing with before deciding my next move, and I needed expert help to evaluate what I'd found so far. Back at the house, I did a quick internet search and found a Dr. Marcus Rivera at the University of Pittsburgh, a historian specializing in numismatics, the study of currency. I called his office and, explaining that I'd inherited some potentially valuable old currency, managed to secure an appointment for the following day. I spent the rest of the day exploring the house more thoroughly, looking for any additional clues about George's past or the source of the hidden money. In his study, I found bookshelves filled with engineering text, histories of the Cold War, and volumes on cryptography and secure communications. One shelf held framed photographs, mostly of the farm in different seasons, but one caught my eye. It showed a much younger George standing with a group of men in suits, all posed in front of what appeared to be some kind of military installation. The photo was dated 1968 and labeled simply Project Meridian Team. I carefully removed it from the frame to see if there was any additional information on the back. And as I did, something fell out. A thin slip of paper with a series of numbers and letters that looked like a code. As I held the paper up to the light, trying to make sense of the sequence, I noticed something odd about the photograph frame itself. The backing seemed thicker than it needed to be. Examining it more closely, I discovered a hidden compartment containing a folded document. When I carefully unfolded it, I found myself looking at a detailed map of the farm, far more precise than the crude sketch I'd found with the money. This map had 7 locations marked with X's, each with a small notation beside it. The tractor was labeled primary, while the chicken coop was secondary. The other 5 locations were spread across the property, each with a cryptic designation that made little sense to me. Contingency, insurance, legacy, witness, and checkmate. I was studying the map when I heard a car pull up outside. Looking out the window, I saw Sheriff Reynolds getting out of her patrol car. I quickly folded the map and slipped it into my pocket before going to greet her. "Sheriff," I said as she approached the porch. "Twice in 2 days, should I be concerned?" "Just following up," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Wanted to make sure you're settling in okay? Finding everything you need?" "So far, so good," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. "Susan's been helpful in showing me around." "Susan Chen's a good woman," Beth said, nodding. "Loyal to your uncle. Probably knows this place better than anyone. Except maybe Frank Miller," I suggested, watching her reaction. "He seems very familiar with the property." Something flickered in Beth's eyes. Caution, perhaps, or concern. "Frank's been neighbors with George for decades, but I wouldn't put too much stock in anything he tells you. They had a complicated relationship." "Well, so I'm gathering in," I said. "Any particular reason you're concerned about him?" Beth seemed to consider her words carefully. "Let's just say Frank Miller has a reputation for looking out for Frank Miller's interests first and foremost, and he's been interested in this property for a very long time." She glanced past me toward the old tractor. "I see you've been working on George's John Deere. Finding anything interesting?" The question seemed innocent enough, but combined with her earlier warning about hidden assets, I sensed she was fishing for information. I decided to test the waters. "Just getting a sense of what it would take to restore it," I said. "Though Frank seems to think it's only good for scrap." Beth's laugh was short and without humor. "I'm sure he does. Well, I should get back to my rounds. Just wanted to check in." She handed me a business card. "Call if you need anything, or if you find anything that concerns you." As she walked back to her car, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sheriff Reynolds knew more about George's secrets than she was letting on. The question was whether she was trying to help me or had her own agenda. That evening, as dusk settled over the farm, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything I discovered in just 2 days. I had found tens of thousands of dollars in cash, gold coins, and potentially valuable collectible currency. I had a detailed map to 5 more hidden caches. I had learned that my reclusive great-uncle had once worked on classified defense projects before abruptly changing careers and becoming a farmer. And I had at least 2 people, Frank Miller and Sheriff Beth Reynolds, who seemed unusually interested in what I might be finding on the property. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I made a decision. I would keep the farm, at least for now. I would find out exactly what George had hidden here and why. And most importantly, I would discover why he had chosen me, of all people, to inherit his secrets. The metal piece George had given me as a child, the key that had helped me access the tractor's fuel tank, now felt heavy in my pocket. It wasn't just a random gift. It was the first breadcrumb on a trail he had laid out years ago, perhaps knowing that someday I would follow it. Tomorrow I would visit Dr. Rivera and learn more about the currency I'd found. I would continue exploring the locations marked on George's map, and I would start to unravel the mystery of what a defense engineer with classified knowledge might have felt the need to hide on a remote farm in western Pennsylvania. As night fell completely, bringing with it a canopy of stars brighter than any I'd seen in years, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. From the tree line at the edge of the property, a glint of light, perhaps binoculars or a scope, caught the last rays of the setting sun before quickly disappearing. Whatever secrets Uncle George had left behind, it was clear I wasn't the only one looking for them. And some secrets, I was beginning to realize, might be dangerous to uncover. The next morning, I carefully packed a selection of the bills I'd found, focusing on the older, more unusual denominations, and drove back to Pittsburgh for my appointment with Dr. Marcus Rivera at the university. The campus was busy with students hurrying between classes, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation of George's farm. Rivera's office was tucked away in the history department, its walls lined with books and display cases filled with coins and currency from different eras. The man himself was in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a curious expression. "Mr. Morgan, you mentioned on the phone that you've inherited some potentially valuable currency. May I see what you've brought?" I carefully laid out the bills on his desk, watching as his expression changed from professional interest to genuine excitement. "My goodness," he said, putting on a pair of white cotton gloves before gently picking up one of the bills. "This is a 1934 $1,000 Federal Reserve note. They're quite rare in this condition." He examined several more bills, his excitement growing. "And this is a $5,000 bill from 1928. Do you realize how uncommon these are?" "I had a feeling they might be valuable," I said. "Can you tell me how much?" Dr. Rivera adjusted his glasses. "Just these two bills alone could be worth upwards of $20,000 each to the right collector, possibly more given their condition. The entire collection you've brought, I'd estimate at least $200,000 in numismatic value, well beyond their face value." I tried to keep my expression neutral, despite the shock I felt. $200,000 from just a small selection of the bills I'd found. "There's something else interesting about these," Dr. Rivera continued, examining one bill under a magnifying glass. "Several of these notes have sequential serial numbers, suggesting they were obtained directly from a bank, all at once. And this one," he pointed to a particularly old-looking bill, "has a very unusual marking." He showed me a tiny symbol stamped near the edge of the bill, barely visible to the naked eye. "This appears to be a security marking used on currency that was allocated to certain government projects during the Cold War era, particularly in the 1960s. It's not something most people would recognize, but I've done some research on financial aspects of classified programs from that period." "What kind of government projects?" I asked, thinking of the photograph I'd found of George with the Project Meridian team. "Various defense and intelligence initiatives," Rivera said. "The government needed ways to fund covert operations that wouldn't appear in official budgets. Specially marked currency was one method." He looked at me curiously. "May I ask where these came from?" I gave him a simplified version of the truth, that I'd inherited them from a relative who had worked as an engineer for defense contractors in the 1960s before becoming a farmer. "Fascinating," Rivera said. "Your relative may have been involved in something quite significant. These bills tell a story not just of value, but of history." He pointed to another bill. "See this marking here? It's similar to ones I've seen associated with the Manhattan Project and later atomic research programs." My mind was racing. George hadn't just hidden money around the farm. He'd hidden money with direct connections to classified government projects. The implications were both intriguing and concerning. "One more thing," Rivera said, carefully examining a bill under ultraviolet light. "There appears to be something written on this note, very faint, only visible under certain conditions." He pointed to what looked like a series of numbers and letters along the margin. "I believe this might be a code of some kind." I left the university with more questions than answers, but also with confirmation that what I'd found was significant, both financially and historically. Dr. Rivera had given me contact information for a trusted appraiser who could help if I decided to sell any of the collectible currency, along with advice about proper storage and handling. On the drive back to the farm, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd learned. George had hidden currency linked to classified Cold War projects around his property. He'd created a map showing 7 hiding places, and people in the small community around the farm seemed unusually interested in what I might be finding. When I arrived back at the farm late that afternoon, I was surprised to see Susan's car still in the driveway. I'd expected her to have left hours ago. As I approached the house, I heard voices coming from inside. Susan's and a man's I didn't recognize. I entered cautiously to find Susan in the kitchen with a tall, thin man in his early 70s. He wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt and with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms still muscular despite his age. His silver hair was cut in a military-style crew cut, and he carried himself with the straight-back posture of someone with military training. "Alex," Susan said, sounding relieved to see me. "This is Robert Winters. He was a friend of your uncle's." "A colleague, actually," the man corrected, extending his hand. "George and I worked together many years ago. When I heard his nephew had inherited the place, I thought I should stop by and pay my respects." His handshake was firm, his gaze direct and assessing. I had the distinct impression I was being evaluated. "How did you know George?" I asked. "Defense work back in the 60s and early 70s, Winters replied. "Classified stuff, mostly. George was brilliant, one of the best engineers I ever worked with." "Robert was just telling me stories about your uncle's early career," Susan said. "Things even I never knew." Winters nodded. "George was a private man, especially after he left the program. I respected that privacy, but we kept in touch over the years. I was sorry to hear of his passing." There was something about Winters that seemed trustworthy, despite my growing caution about anyone showing interest in George's property. Perhaps it was the genuine affection in his voice when he spoke of my uncle, or the fact that Susan seemed comfortable with him. Over coffee, Winters shared stories of George's work on classified engineering projects, careful to avoid specifics that might still be sensitive. According to Winters, George had been part of a team developing advanced technologies for the Defense Department, innovations that were decades ahead of their time. "Why did he leave?" I asked. "Why give up a successful engineering career to become a farmer?" Winters and Susan exchanged a glance before he answered. "There was a disagreement about how certain technologies should be used," he said carefully. "George had ethical concerns about the potential applications of his work. When he voiced those concerns, there were complications." "And what kind of complications?" "The kind that can end careers and worse," Winters said grimly. "George made some powerful enemies. Walking away to this farm was his way of protecting himself and others who shared his concerns." This was starting to sound like something from a spy novel, yet the serious expressions on both Winters and Susan's faces told me they weren't exaggerating. "Did these powerful enemies have names?" I asked. "Some worked for the government directly," Winters said. "Others were private contractors. One company in particular, Meridian Defense, was heavily involved. Their CEO at the time, a man named Victor Blackwood, had a personal vendetta against George after the project was shut down." The name Meridian sent a chill through me, reminding me of the Project Meridian team photo I'd found. "Is Meridian still around?" I asked. "Very much so," Winters confirmed. "They've diversified, grown larger, still have major defense contracts. Blackwood's son, Edward, runs the company now, but from what I hear, he's cut from the same cloth as his father." After Winters left, promising to stay in touch, I showed Susan the detailed map I'd found hidden in the picture frame and told her about Dr. Rivera's assessment of the currency. "There's something big going on here, Susan," I said. "George didn't just hide money, he hid evidence. But evidence of what?" Susan's expression was troubled. "George never shared the details with me, but he once told me that if anything happened to him, the truth was scattered across the farm in pieces. He said only someone with the right skills would be able to put those pieces together." She looked at me pointedly. "Someone with engineering knowledge like yours." The next morning, I decided to investigate the third location marked on George's map, labeled Insurance. According to the map, it was located beneath the floor of the old storage shed near the north field. The wooden structure was smaller than the barn, but in similar disrepair, its door hanging from a single hinge. Inside, farm tools hung on walls and old sacks of feed had hardened into concrete-like lumps. The floor was made of wide wooden planks, worn smooth by years of use. I examined the boards carefully, looking for signs of any that might have been removed and replaced. In the corner, I noticed one board that seemed slightly different from the others. The grain pattern didn't quite match. Using a crowbar from the barn, I carefully pried it up to reveal a small space underneath. Inside was a metal box similar to the ones I'd found before. This box contained more cash, though less than the previous caches, along with a small leather pouch holding gold coins. But what caught my attention was a collection of microfiche slides and what appeared to be engineering diagrams, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The diagrams showed designs for what looked like advanced energy systems, far more sophisticated than anything that should have existed in the 1960s. Handwritten notes in George's spidery writing covered the margins, many referring to sustainable applications and civilian use potential. As I was examining these documents, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car coming up the driveway. Quickly repacking everything into the metal box, I slid it under a nearby workbench and replaced the floorboard just as Sheriff Reynolds' patrol car pulled up outside. I stepped out of the shed, trying to look casual. "Sheriff, another visit?" Beth's expression was more serious than during her previous visits. "Got a report of a suspicious vehicle parked along the road near your property last night. Thought you should know." "What kind of vehicle?" "Black SUV, tinted windows, no plates visible. When one of my deputies approached to check it out, it drove off." Her eyes scanned the farm, lingering on the shed I'd just exited. "Been finding anything interesting around the place?" "Just getting a feel for what needs repair," I said, evading the question. "Lot of work ahead." Beth nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't entirely believe me. "Alex, I'm going to be straight with you. This property, and whatever might be hidden on it, has been a subject of interest for certain people for years. George knew how to keep secrets, but he also made some dangerous enemies." "Like Meridian Defense?" I ventured, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise I'd seen from her. "Where did you hear that name?" "A friend of George's stopped by yesterday, Robert Winters. Said George worked with him on classified projects." Beth's posture changed subtly, becoming more alert. "Robert Winters was here? Did he say what he wanted?" "Just to pay his respects, share some stories about George." Beth looked skeptical. "Be careful, Alex. Not everyone who claims to have been George's friend has your best interest at heart. This isn't just about money or property. There are people who believe George hid something far more valuable than titanium or gold. Information that could be damaging to very powerful interests." Before I could respond, her radio crackled with a call. She answered, then turned back to me. "I need to go. Just watch your back, okay? And if you see that black SUV again, call me immediately." As she drove away, I couldn't help wondering whose side Sheriff Reynolds was really on. Was she trying to protect me, or was she monitoring me for someone else? I waited until her patrol car disappeared down the road before retrieving the metal box from under the workbench. The engineering diagrams needed expert eyes, someone who could tell me what George had been working on and why it might still matter decades later. Back at the house, I carefully photographed the diagrams and microfiche slides, then secured the originals in my car. I was beginning to understand why George had scattered his secrets across the property rather than keeping them in one place. If someone was searching, they'd have to find all 7 caches to get the complete picture. As evening approached, I decided to investigate one more location before dark. The old well house marked as contingency on the map. The small stone structure stood near the edge of the property, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Inside, a hand-dug well had long since been replaced by modern plumbing, but the stone circle remained, covered by wooden boards. I removed the boards carefully, expecting to find another hidden container, but the well appeared empty except for about a foot of stagnant water at the bottom. Puzzled, I examined the interior more closely, shining my flashlight along the stone walls. About 3 feet down, I noticed something unusual. One of the stones protruded slightly more than the others. When I pressed it, I was startled to hear a mechanical click. A section of the stone wall slid open, revealing a hidden compartment built into the side of the well. Inside was a waterproof case containing a small laptop computer that looked at least 15 years old, along with a hand-cranked charging device, multiple flash drives, and a notebook filled with what appeared to be encryption keys and passwords. This was different from the other caches, more modern, more technical. A note taped to the laptop read simply, "For the right eyes only. Password. Remember the oak tree." The oak tree. My mind immediately went to the massive oak where the old John Deere tractor had been parked, the first place I'd found hidden assets. But there was something else about that tree, a memory from my childhood visit to the farm. George had shown me something there, a carving or marking of some kind. It was too dark now to investigate further, but first thing tomorrow, I'd check that oak tree for clues. For now, I carefully repacked everything and returned to the house, my mind spinning with all I'd discovered. That night, I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening intently. Another crash came from downstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps. Someone had broken into the house. I grabbed my phone and a heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon, then moved silently to the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, but I could hear someone moving through the rooms below, opening drawers and cabinets. I considered calling Sheriff Reynolds but hesitated, still unsure if she was truly an ally. Instead, I crept down the hall toward the back stairs, hoping to get a look at the intruder without being seen. From the landing, I could see a beam of light moving around the study. A figure in dark clothing was methodically searching through George's desk and bookshelves, occasionally taking photos of documents with a small camera. I was weighing my options when a floorboard creaked beneath my foot. The light immediately swung in my direction, momentarily blinding me. I raised my flashlight, prepared to defend myself, when a voice called out, "Alex Morgan, don't be alarmed. I need to speak with you about your uncle." The intruder stepped forward into the dim light from the windows. A woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and intense eyes. She wore all black, including gloves, and carried herself with the confident poise of someone with tactical training. "Breaking into my house is a hell of a way to start a conversation," I said, keeping my flashlight raised. "Who are you?" "My name is Emily Parker. I'm the daughter of James Parker. He worked with your uncle on Project Meridian." She slowly set down her flashlight as a show of good faith. "I've been trying to find the evidence George and my father gathered for over a decade." "Evidence of what?" I asked, still wary. "Corruption, illegal weapons development, cover-ups that got people killed, including my father." Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the underlying emotion. "Your uncle was supposed to meet with me the week he died, but he never showed up. When I heard you'd inherited the farm, I hoped you might have found something." "Why should I believe you?" I demanded. "You broke into my house in the middle of the night." "Because I've been watching this property for days, and I'm not the only one." She pulled out her phone and showed me photos of men in tactical gear, moving around the perimeter of the farm at night. "Meridian has sent a team to find whatever George hid here. They've been waiting for you to leave so they can search the place thoroughly." The photos matched the warning Sheriff Reynolds had given me about the suspicious vehicle. I lowered my flashlight slightly. "What exactly are you looking for?" Project Meridian was officially about developing advanced energy systems for military applications, Emily explained. But unofficially, Meridian Defense was weaponizing the technology against the government's directives. When George and my father tried to stop it, people started dying in accidents. My father was killed in a car crash that was made to look like brake failure. George escaped by essentially disappearing into this farm. Her story aligned with what Winters had told me, adding credibility to her claims. "George believed Meridian was still developing the prohibited weapons," she continued. "He spent decades gathering evidence, building a case that could finally hold them accountable. That evidence is what they're searching for, and what I need to find before they do." "How do you know all this?" "My father left me a letter to be opened on my 30th birthday. It explained everything he and George had been working on and why he believed his life was in danger. By then, George was the only one left who knew the whole truth." Her expression hardened. "Meridian has powerful government connections and virtually unlimited resources. They've buried this story for decades. This may be our last chance to expose them." Something in her intensity convinced me she was telling the truth, or at least believed she was. I made a decision. "I've found several hidden caches around the property," I admitted. "Currency, gold, documents, and some kind of specialized computer setup." Emily's eyes widened. "The authentication system. George mentioned it in his last message to me. It contains encryption keys needed to verify the evidence." "There's more," I said. "According to a map I found, there are 7 hiding places scattered across the farm. I've only located 4 so far." Emily looked both excited and concerned. "We need to find the others quickly. If Meridian's team is here, they won't hesitate to take everything by force once they realize what you've discovered." As if on cue, headlights swept across the windows as a vehicle turned into the driveway. We both ducked down instinctively. "Expecting company?" Emily whispered. "No," I replied, peering cautiously through the curtains. A black SUV with tinted windows had parked near the barn, its headlights now extinguished. Two figures emerged, moving with the deliberate precision of trained operatives. "Meridian," Emily breathed. "They're making their move." "We need to get out of here," I said, thinking quickly. "I have copies of the most important documents in my car, and I've hidden the originals away from the house." "Smart," Emily nodded. "Is there a back way out?" I led her through the kitchen to a door that opened onto a small vegetable garden. We slipped outside into the darkness, keeping low and using the overgrown plants as cover. My car was parked behind the house, partially hidden by a stand of trees. As we crept toward it, a powerful flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard from the direction of the barn. One of the Meridian operatives was methodically searching the outbuildings. "We'll never make it to your car without being seen," Emily whispered. "We need a diversion." I thought quickly, remembering the old propane tank behind the chicken coop. It likely still contained some gas, even after years of disuse. "Follow me," I whispered, leading Emily along the shadow of a stone wall that ran behind the garden. We reached the chicken coop undetected, and I located the rusted propane tank. "What's the plan?" Emily asked. "Basic engineering," I replied, quickly loosening the valve on the tank just enough to create a slow leak. Then I found an old rag and a lighter from my pocket. "When I give the signal, run for the car. Don't stop for anything." I positioned the tank so it faced away from our escape route, then created a simple delayed ignition using the rag. Once lit, we'd have about 30 seconds before the leaking gas caught fire. Not enough to cause a major explosion with such an old tank, but sufficient to create a bright flash and noise that would draw attention. "Ready?" I asked, lighter poised. Emily nodded, tense to run. I lit the rag, and we immediately sprinted toward my car, staying low and using every bit of cover available. Behind us, the propane tank ignited with a whoosh and a bright flare, followed by alarm shouts from the Meridian operatives. We reached my car, and I fumbled with the keys, adrenaline making my hands shake. The engine roared to life just as flashlight beams began moving rapidly in our direction. I threw the car into reverse, backed it up quickly, then shifted into drive and accelerated down the farm's back access road, a route not visible from the main house. "They'll follow us," Emily said, looking back through the rear window. "They'll have vehicles stationed at the main road." "We're not taking the main road," I replied, turning onto a narrow dirt track that led through the neighboring farm. "George showed me this back way out when I was a kid. It connects to a county road about 2 miles from here." As we bounced along the rough track, headlights appeared behind us. The Meridian team had already found our trail. The SUV was faster and more powerful than my sedan, quickly gaining ground. "They're catching up," Emily warned, tension evident in her voice. I pushed my car as fast as I dared on the uneven surface, knowing one wrong move could send us into a ditch. The county road was just ahead, visible in the moonlight, when the SUV behind us accelerated dramatically, closing the gap. Just as we reached the pavement, the SUV rammed us from behind, sending my car skidding. I fought the wheel, barely maintaining control as we fishtailed onto the county road. "Hang on," I shouted, flooring the accelerator. My car responded, pulling ahead slightly, but the SUV stayed with us, its powerful engine a constant threat in the rearview mirror. "Any ideas?" I asked Emily, who was bracing herself against the dashboard. "Head for town," she said. "They won't risk a confrontation with witnesses around." I nodded and took the next turn toward the small town near George's farm. The SUV continued its pursuit, but kept a slightly greater distance now that we were on public roads where other vehicles might appear. As we approached the town limits, the SUV suddenly dropped back, then turned off onto a side road, its taillights disappearing into the night. "They're backing off," Emily said, her relief evident. "But they'll be watching. We can't go back to the farm tonight." "I know someone who might help us," I said, thinking of Dr. Rivera at the university. "Someone who's already seen part of what George left behind and understood its significance." "Can you trust them?" Emily asked. "I think so. Right now, we don't have many other options." As we drove toward Pittsburgh, I tried to process everything that had happened in the last hour. The farm had been compromised. Meridian's operatives were actively searching for George's hidden evidence, and I was now on the run with a woman I just met who claimed to be the daughter of my uncle's former colleague. The peaceful inheritance I thought I'd received had turned into something far more dangerous and potentially far more important. Whatever George had hidden on that farm, powerful people were willing to go to extreme lengths to ensure it stayed buried. I glanced at Emily, who was scanning the road behind us for signs of pursuit. Your father and my uncle, what exactly did they discover that was worth killing for? Emily's expression was grim in the dim light of the dashboard. A technology that could change the world, or destroy it, in the wrong hands. And evidence that Meridian has been secretly developing it for decades against every international agreement and ethical standard. What kind of technology? The kind that makes nuclear weapons look like firecrackers, she said quietly. The kind that gives whoever controls it power beyond anything we've seen before. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the weight of George's legacy suddenly feeling much heavier. My great-uncle hadn't just left me a farm and some hidden money. He'd left me the responsibility of completing a mission he'd spent decades working on, exposing a deadly secret before it was too late. And now that I'd found part of what he'd hidden, there was no turning back. Meridian knew who I was and what I might have discovered. They would be watching, waiting for their chance to silence me, just as they had silenced others who threatened their secrets. As the lights of Pittsburgh appeared on the horizon, I made a silent promise to George. I would finish what he started. I would find all the pieces he'd scattered across the farm, and somehow I would make sure the truth finally came to light. Dr. Marcus Rivera lived in a modest brick townhouse near the university campus. Despite the late hour, he answered my urgent call and agreed to meet us. When we arrived just after midnight, his expression showed both concern and curiosity as he ushered us inside. "Mr. Morgan, this is unexpected," he said, eyeing Emily with cautious interest. "You said it was an emergency?" "Someone broke into the farm looking for what I found," I explained. "We had to leave quickly." "This is Emily Parker. Her father worked with my uncle on classified projects in the 1960s. Dr. Rivera's living room was lined with bookshelves and display cases containing historical artifacts and rare coins. He gestured for us to sit while he prepared coffee, giving me a moment to explain to Emily about the currency I'd shown him earlier. The bills had security markings linking them to classified Cold War projects, I told her. Dr. Rivera recognized them immediately. "My father mentioned that they diverted funds for their personal investigation," Emily said. "They needed resources that couldn't be traced back to official channels." Dr. Rivera returned with coffee and listened intently as I described everything that had happened since our meeting. Finding the additional caches, the engineering diagrams, the laptop, and finally the confrontation with Meridian's operatives. "This is far beyond currency authentication," he said when I finished. "What you're describing sounds like evidence of historical significance and potentially ongoing national security implications. That's why we need your help," I said. "We need somewhere safe to examine what I've found so far and someone with the knowledge to help us understand it." Rivera considered this, his academic curiosity clearly piqued. "I have colleagues in the engineering department who might be able to help with the technical aspects. Discreetly, of course. And my office at the university has secure storage facilities designed for valuable historical documents." "Can we trust them?" Emily asked. "Professor Kaminsky worked on energy systems for NASA in the 70s and 80s, Rivera replied. "If these diagrams involve advanced energy technology as you suspect, he's our best resource. And he has no connection to defense contractors or government agencies." While Rivera made arrangements, Emily and I laid out what we knew on his dining room table. The microfiche slides showed technical specifications for something called the M7 conversion system. The engineering diagrams detailed components that looked like nothing I'd seen before, despite my engineering background. My father's letter mentioned that Project Meridian was originally conceived as a revolutionary clean energy system, Emily explained, something that could extract energy from what they called quantum vacuum fluctuations, essentially drawing power from empty space itself. "That sounds like science fiction," I said. "The theoretical foundation had been established since the 1940s, she replied, but the practical application was beyond the technology of the time. George and my father were part of the breakthrough that made it possible." The military was interested because it could provide unlimited power for bases and equipment without supply lines or fuel. And Meridian Defense saw weapons potential, I guessed. Emily nodded grimly. A system that can extract energy can also release it. They realized they could create directed energy weapons more powerful than anything in existence. When my father and George refused to help weaponize the technology, they were pushed out of the project. But not before they gathered evidence of what Meridian was planning. Rivera rejoined us. Professor Kaminsky can meet us at the university at 7 a.m. I've also contacted a digital forensics expert who might be able to help with the old laptop. For now, you're welcome to use my guest room to get some rest. I'll keep watch. Despite my exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. My mind kept returning to the farm, wondering what else George had hidden there, and whether Meridian's team was still searching. I thought of Susan, hoping she was safe at her own home and not caught up in this escalating situation. Early the next morning, we met Professor Kaminsky in his lab at the engineering department. He was a tall, stooped man in his 70s with bushy white eyebrows and hands that showed the calluses of someone who still worked regularly with tools despite his academic position. As he examined the engineering diagrams, his expression shifted from professional interest to astonishment. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "If I'm interpreting these correctly, what you have here is a system for extracting zero-point energy from quantum vacuum fluctuations. The theoretical work exists, but I've never seen a practical implementation designed at this level of detail." "Could it work?" I asked. "With today's materials and computing power?" "Almost certainly." He looked up, his eyes bright with excitement. "This could revolutionize energy production worldwide. No fuel, no emissions, potentially limitless power from a relatively small device." "And as a weapon?" Emily asked quietly. Kaminsky's expression darkened. "If the energy extraction process were suddenly reversed, the rapid release could be catastrophic, like a bomb, but without the radioactive fallout of nuclear weapons. Theoretically, it could be calibrated for different yields, from taking out a single building to— "To what?" I prompted when he hesitated. "To destroying an entire city," he finished grimly. While Professor Kaminsky continued analyzing the diagrams, the digital forensics expert, a young woman named Layla Sato, worked on accessing the old laptop we'd found. The hand-crank charging device had provided enough power to boot up the system, but we still needed the password. "Remember the oak tree?" I murmured, recalling the note attached to the laptop. "It must refer to something specific about that tree on the farm." Emily looked thoughtful. "Did your uncle ever show you anything special about an oak tree? A marking, a carving, something distinctive?" The childhood memory that had been tickling the edges of my mind suddenly came into focus. "The longitude and latitude," I said. "When I visited as a kid, George showed me numbers carved into the base of the oak tree. He said it was the exact coordinates of the farm and that navigators always needed to know precisely where they were." "Try those coordinates as the password," Layla suggested. "I don't remember the exact numbers," I admitted. "We can look them up," Dr. Rivera said, pulling out his phone. He found the coordinates for George's farm and read them aloud. Layla entered them, but the system rejected the password. "Maybe it's formatted differently," she suggested. "No decimal points, or with a special character between the numbers?" We tried several variations without success. "Wait," I said suddenly. "George wouldn't have used the coordinates of the farm itself. That would be too obvious if someone else found the laptop." I thought back to our conversation under the oak tree. He said something about true navigation requiring a fixed reference point, a landmark you could always count on. "What landmark?" Emily asked. I closed my eyes, trying to recall George's exact words. He mentioned a lighthouse, said his father had taken him there as a boy, and it had been a guide for generations of sailors. "A specific lighthouse?" Dr. Rivera asked. "Point something, on Lake Erie, I think." "Point Abino Lighthouse?" Dr. Rivera suggested. "It's one of the most famous on Lake Erie, not too far from here." We looked up the coordinates for Point Abino Lighthouse and tried them as the password. The laptop screen flickered, then displayed a simple interface with several encrypted files. "We're in," Layla said, sounding impressed. Your uncle was serious about security. "This is a custom-built system with encryption that was well ahead of its time." She began working on the files, explaining that decrypting them would take time. Meanwhile, Professor Kaminsky had completed his preliminary analysis of the diagrams. What you have here is only part of the complete system, he explained. These components connect to others that aren't shown in these particular diagrams. You'd need the full set to understand exactly how everything integrates. There are 3 more caches we haven't found yet, I said. The missing pieces could be in any of them. Or all of them, Emily added. George would have shattered the information to prevent anyone from getting the complete picture too easily. A sudden thought struck me. Susan, George's housekeeper. She might know something that could help us. I should call her, make sure she's okay after what happened last night. I stepped away to make the call, but Susan didn't answer. Concerned, I called Sheriff Reynolds next, hoping she might check on Susan despite my lingering uncertainty about whose side the sheriff was really on. To my surprise, Beth answered immediately. Alex, where are you? There was a break-in at the farm last night. When my deputies responded, they found signs of a struggle and your car gone. Is Susan okay? I asked urgently. Susan Chen wasn't at the farm, Beth replied, but someone tore through the place looking for something. What's going on, Alex? I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I found some things George left behind, things that certain people want badly enough to break in and search the property. You need to come in, Beth said firmly. Whatever you found, you could be in danger. Let me help you. I'm not sure who to trust right now, I admitted. Trust me enough to meet somewhere public, she countered. Bring whatever evidence you have. I have resources that can protect you while we sort this out. I'll think about it, I said noncommittally, then ended the call. When I returned to the others, Layla had made progress with the encrypted files. Most of these are still locked down tight, but I've accessed what appears to be a video file. It looks like your uncle recorded a message. She turned the laptop so we could all see the screen. George's face appeared, much older than I remembered, his features lined with age but his eyes still sharp and alert. The timestamp showed the recording had been made just 2 weeks before his death. If you're watching this, George began, then you've found the laptop and figured out the password. I hope that means you're my nephew, Alex. I've been following your career from a distance. Your engineering background and problem-solving abilities are why I chose you to inherit the farm, and everything hidden on it. I felt a chill hearing him address me directly across time. What I'm about to tell you will sound incredible, George continued. In the 1960s, I was part of a team that developed technology capable of extracting energy from quantum vacuum fluctuations, essentially creating a limitless clean power source. The military application was supposed to be for sustainable energy production at remote bases, but Meridian Defense, the primary contractor, secretly developed weaponized versions. George's expression hardened. When James Parker and I discovered the weapons program, we gathered evidence and prepared to blow the whistle. But before we could, James died in a suspicious accident. I knew I'd be next, so I disappeared to the farm, taking key evidence with me. He leaned closer to the camera. For decades, I've monitored Meridian's activities through contacts still in the defense sector. They never abandoned the weapons program. They just took it deeper underground. They're close to deploying systems that could change the balance of global power and potentially kill millions. George's voice became urgent. The evidence I've gathered is scattered across the farm in 7 locations. You need to find all of it. The complete technical specifications are divided between multiple hiding places, so no single discovery would reveal everything. Once you have all the pieces, contact Robert Winters. He was our ally inside the system, and he has connections who can help expose Meridian's illegal weapons program. The mention of Winters sent a shock through me. He'd already made contact, claiming to be George's friend, but could he truly be trusted? Be careful who you trust, George continued, as if reading my thoughts. Meridian has infiltrated multiple government agencies over the years. They have resources, influence, and no moral constraints. They've eliminated people for far less than what you now know. George's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry to place this burden on you, Alex. I had hoped to handle this myself, but time is running out for me. My health is failing, and Meridian is getting closer to deployment. You're my last hope for stopping them. The video ended, leaving us in stunned silence. Well, Dr. Rivera said finally, that certainly clarifies the significance of what you've found. And the danger, Emily added grimly. If my father and George were right about Meridian's weapons program, we're talking about technology that could make its possessor virtually unstoppable. Professor Kaminsky nodded gravely. Based on these partial diagrams, I believe they were absolutely correct about the potential. This technology, weaponized, would be devastating. We need to get back to the farm, I said, standing up. We have to find the remaining caches before Meridian does. After what happened last night, they'll be watching the property, Emily warned. Going back would be walking into a trap. We can't just abandon the evidence George spent decades collecting, I argued. Besides, Susan isn't answering her phone. I'm worried about her. Perhaps there's a compromise, Dr. Rivera suggested. I have a colleague in the geography department who could provide satellite imagery of the farm. If Meridian has people stationed there, we might be able to see them and plan accordingly. While Rivera made arrangements, Layla continued working on the encrypted files. Your uncle was thorough, she commented. Each file seems to require a different decryption key. He really didn't want anyone accessing everything at once. The remaining caches probably contain the keys, Emily suggested, a security measure to ensure all pieces needed to be found. An hour later, we were examining high-resolution satellite images of George's farm. The pictures, taken just 30 minutes earlier, showed 2 vehicles parked near the house and several figures moving around the property. They're still searching, Emily said, and they're not even trying to be subtle about it anymore. I studied the images, focusing on the locations marked on George's map that we hadn't yet explored. The next cache is supposed to be here, I said, pointing to an area near the old barn, marked as Legacy on the map. That's where most of their activity seems to be concentrated, Professor Kaminsky observed. They may have already found it. Or they're still looking, or I countered. We need to get back there. Not in daylight, Emily said firmly. If we're going back, we wait until dark. And we need a plan better than just sneaking onto the property and hoping for the best. She was right, of course. Rushing in would be foolish. What do you suggest? First, we need to know exactly who we're dealing with, Emily said. How many operatives, what equipment they have, whether they've involved local authorities. Sheriff Reynolds called me earlier, I told him. She knows about the break-in and wanted me to come in with whatever evidence I've found. Do you trust her? Emily asked. I'm not sure, I admitted. She's been interested in the farm since I arrived, but I can't tell if she's concerned for my safety or has other motives. We should assume Meridian has influence with local authorities, Emily said. It's how they've operated for decades. While we debated our next move, Layla called us over to the laptop. I've managed to access another file, some kind of personnel document. It looks like a list of Meridian employees and associates from the 1960s to the present. We crowded around the screen as she scrolled through the document. Names, positions, and brief notes filled the spreadsheet-like interface. Most meant nothing to me, but Emily pointed to several she recognized from her father's letters. Wait, I said suddenly. Go back up a few rows. Layla scrolled back, and there it was. Reynolds Elizabeth Beth, County Sheriff, recruited 2018. Granddaughter of original team member Thomas Reynolds. Reliable asset for monitoring farm and reporting unusual activity. Sheriff Reynolds is working for Meridian, I said, the betrayal hitting harder than I'd expected. She's been watching me since I arrived, reporting everything I've done. And Frank Miller? Emily asked. Layla searched the document and found his name. Miller Franklin, local farmer, son of Richard Miller, deceased. Intermittent cooperation based on financial incentive. Believes G. Wilson hid valuable assets on property, not privy to project details. So Frank is just a greedy neighbor who knows there's something valuable hidden on the farm, but doesn't understand what it really is, I concluded. What about Winters? Emily asked. Robert Winters, George mentioned him in the video. Layla searched again, but this time the result was concerning. Winters, Robert, original project engineer, former ally to Wilson Parker, compromised 2015, now reports to E. Blackwood directly, used as misinformation channel if needed. Winters has been turned, Emily said, her voice tight with anger. He's working for Meridian now, probably sent to gain your trust and find out what you've discovered. This revelation left me reeling. Winters had seemed so genuine, so respectful of George's memory. Had it all been an act? Or had he been coerced into betraying his former colleagues? What about Susan Chen? I asked, suddenly worried about her absence. Layla searched again. Chen, Susan? Housekeeper? Friend to G. Wilson? No contact. Consider high risk for interference. Monitor but avoid direct engagement unless necessary. They've been watching Susan for years but haven't approached her, I said, relieved that at least she wasn't listed as a Meridian asset. She must be truly loyal to George. But where is she now, Emily wondered. If she's not answering her phone, a terrible thought struck me. What if Meridian took her? What if they think she knows where the remaining caches are hidden? It's possible, Emily acknowledged grimly. All the more reason we need a careful plan before returning to the farm. As the evening approached, we developed a strategy. Dr. Rivera would remain at the university with the evidence we'd already collected, ensuring it would be secure even if something happened to us. Professor Kaminsky would continue analyzing the technical diagrams, while Layla worked on accessing the remaining encrypted files. Emily and I would return to the farm after midnight, when the Meridian team might be less alert. Our primary objectives were to locate any remaining caches and, if possible, find out what had happened to Susan. We borrowed night vision equipment from the university's archaeology department, which used it for nocturnal surveys of historical sites. Remember, Emily cautioned as we prepared to leave, these people are professionals with military training and advanced equipment. Our only advantages are knowledge of the property and the element of surprise. If we're discovered, we don't engage. We retreat immediately. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. In just a few days, my life had transformed from that of an unemployed engineer to someone involved in what felt like an espionage thriller. But the stakes were real. George's legacy, Susan's safety, and potentially millions of lives if Meridian's weapons program came to fruition. We were about to leave when Dr. Rivera's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then handed it to me with a concerned expression. It's for you, someone named Susan. I took the phone anxiously. Susan, are you okay? Alex, her voice was low, urgent. Don't come back to the farm. Men with guns are everywhere, searching through everything. They took me from my house this morning, questioned me for hours about George's assets. Did they hurt you? I asked, relief at hearing her voice mixed with concern for her safety. No, they just frightened me. They let me go a few hours ago, but I'm certain they're watching me. I'm at my sister's house in Erie now. She paused, then continued even more quietly. Before they took me, I managed to remove something from the farm, something George gave me years ago for safekeeping. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should give it to whoever inherited the farm, but only if they had proven themselves trustworthy. What is it? I asked. A key. She replied. Not an ordinary key, it looks custom-made, and a set of coordinates written in George's handwriting. He said it was his ultimate contingency, something to be used only as a last resort. New hope surged through me. Susan, this could be crucial. Can you meet us somewhere safe to give us the key? There's a diner called Mel's on Route 20, about 30 miles east of the farm. I can meet you there in 2 hours. We'll be there, I promised. And Susan, thank you for staying loyal to George. He was my friend, she said simply, the only one who treated me with respect when I first came to this country. I would never betray his trust. After ending the call, I relayed the conversation to the others. This changes our plan, I said. Instead of going directly to the farm, we meet Susan first and find out what this ultimate contingency is. It could be the key to everything, Emily agreed. George clearly had fallback plans we don't yet understand. 2 hours later, Emily and I sat in a booth at Mel's Diner, a classic roadside establishment with vinyl seats and the smell of coffee and pee hanging in the air. Despite the late hour, several truckers occupied other booths, providing enough activity that we didn't stand out. Susan arrived precisely on time, looking tired but resolute. She slid into the booth beside me, her eyes constantly scanning the entrance and windows. I wasn't followed, she said quietly. I took every precaution George taught me over the years. From her purse, she withdrew a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was an unusual key with complex ridges and notches unlike any standard key pattern. Accompanying it was a slip of paper with coordinates written in George's distinctive handwriting. He made me memorize what he told me about this, Susan said. The key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank in Buffalo, New York. The coordinates are for a location in Canada, just across the border. George said if Meridian ever came for his evidence, this would be the final proof that would bring them down. Did he tell you what's in the safe deposit box? Emily asked. Susan shook her head. Only that it contains something that would lead to the coordinates. He was very particular about the sequence. First the bank, then the location in Canada. We'll need to go to Buffalo immediately, I said, before Meridian realizes what we have. There's one more thing, Susan added, her expression grave. The men who questioned me, they mentioned a deadline, something about a demonstration for potential buyers happening in 3 days. They seemed very concerned about finding all of George's evidence before then. Emily and I exchanged alarmed glances. They're planning to demonstrate the weapon, she said, probably to foreign military officials or private military contractors. Then we have less than 72 hours to stop them, I said, the pressure of our mission suddenly intensifying. We need to get to that bank as soon as it opens tomorrow morning. As we left the diner, a sense of both urgency and purpose filled me. George had created an intricate puzzle, scattering pieces across different locations, ensuring that only someone with both determination and the right knowledge could assemble the complete picture. Now it was up to us to finish what he had started, to follow his final breadcrumbs and expose Meridian's deadly secret before their weapon could be unleashed on the world. With Susan's key in my pocket and Emily at my side, I felt for the first time that we might actually succeed. But as we drove toward Buffalo through the dark night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Meridian was closing in. They had resources, influence, and a 3-decade head start. And somewhere in the shadows, Robert Winters, the man George had once trusted enough to name as an ally in his video message, was now working for the enemy. The road ahead would only get more dangerous as we got closer to the truth. And with a deadline of just 3 days, the margin for error had vanished completely. Whatever waited for us in that safe deposit box, it had to be the breakthrough we desperately needed. Buffalo greeted us with a cold drizzle as we arrived just before dawn. The city was barely stirring, streets glistening under streetlights, as we found a modest hotel near the First National Bank. We needed a few hours of rest before the bank opened at 9, and I was running on fumes after the events of the past few days. In our adjoining rooms, Emily and I took turns showering and changing into clean clothes we'd purchased at an all-night store along the way. The simple act of washing away the dirt and tension felt restorative, giving me a moment to gather my thoughts. As I sat on the edge of the bed, turning George's key over in my hands, the reality of our situation struck me anew. Less than a week ago, I'd been an unemployed engineer with mounting debt and diminishing prospects. Now I was involved in a race against a powerful defense contractor to uncover evidence of illegal weapons development, evidence my great-uncle had spent decades collecting and hiding. A soft knock at the connecting door pulled me from my thoughts. Emily entered, her hair still damp, wearing jeans and a dark sweater. "We should contact Dr. Rivera," she said. "See if they've made any progress with the files on the laptop." I nodded and made the call. Rivera answered immediately, his voice low despite the early hour. "We've had a breakthrough," he said. "Layla managed to access more of the encrypted files. One contains detailed records of Meridian's weapons tests over the past 20 years, tests that violated multiple international treaties." "That's exactly the kind of evidence we need," I said. "There's more," Rivera continued. "Professor Kaminsky completed his analysis of the technical diagrams. He believes the technology described is not just theoretical, it's fully operational. And based on power calculations, a weaponized version could create an energy discharge equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon, but without radiation. That matches what my father described in his letter," Emily said, leaning close to hear Rivera's voice. "Did you find any indication of where Meridian might be planning their demonstration?" "Nothing specific," Rivera replied, "but Layla found references to a testing facility near Lake Ontario. It could be on either the U.S. or Canadian side of the border." The mention of Canada sent a chill through me. The coordinates Susan gave us are in Canada, just across the border from Buffalo. That can't be a coincidence. "Be extremely careful," Rivera warned. "Kaminsky believes this technology, if weaponized as we suspect, would be considered a strategic asset by any government. If Meridian is indeed planning a demonstration for potential buyers, they'll have security measures beyond anything we've encountered so far. What about Winters? I asked. Any more information on him from the files? Only that he was originally part of George's team but was leveraged by Meridian in 2015. The file doesn't specify how they turned him, but it suggests it involved family members. This gave me pause. Perhaps Winters hadn't betrayed George willingly, but had been coerced. It didn't change our current situation, but it added another layer of complexity to the moral landscape we were navigating. After ending the call, Emily and I spent the remaining time before the bank opened reviewing what we knew and planning our next steps. We agreed that I would access the safe deposit box alone while Emily kept watch outside the bank. If anything went wrong, she would take what we'd already discovered to Rivera and ensure it reached the proper authorities. At precisely 9:00 a.m., I entered First National Bank of Buffalo, trying to project casual confidence despite my nerves. The bank's interior was all polished marble and dark wood, speaking to its long history in the city. I approached a teller and explained I needed to access a safe deposit box left to me by my great-uncle. The process was surprisingly straightforward. After verifying my identity and confirming that George had indeed designated me as the authorized accessor in the event of his death, a bank officer named Ms. Peterman led me to the vault area. She matched my key with the bank's companion key, and together we opened box number 773. "I'll give you privacy," Ms. Peterman said, showing me to a small consultation room. "Just ring the bell when you are finished." Inside the safe deposit box was a waterproof pouch containing 3 items: a small leather-bound notebook, a USB drive, and what appeared to be an old-fashioned compass, though more elaborate than any I'd seen before. The compass housing was made of brass with intricate engravings, and additional dials and markings surrounded the main directional needle. I opened the notebook first. It contained detailed instructions written in George's hand. The coordinates lead to a location on the Canadian shore of Lake Ontario. This specialized compass has been calibrated to guide you to the exact spot, accounting for magnetic anomalies in the area that would throw off standard navigation equipment. The USB drive contains security schematics and bypass protocols for Meridian's primary testing facility, which they built secretly on Canadian soil to avoid U.S. regulations and oversight. George's notes continued, explaining that he had discovered Meridian's secret facility in 2010 while following up on shipping manifests that showed equipment being transported to a supposedly abandoned industrial site near the lake. He had spent years covertly mapping the facility and identifying its security weaknesses. "This is their primary testing ground for the weaponized M system," George wrote, "and likely where they will conduct any demonstration for potential buyers. The facility appears on no official records. It's registered as a storage site for a shell company. What happens there is completely off the books." The final page of the notebook contained a personal message addressed directly to me. "Alex, if you're reading this, then you've followed the trail I left and proven yourself worthy of this final task. I'm sorry for placing this burden on you, but you were the only one with both the technical understanding and the moral compass needed to see this through. The evidence you've gathered, combined with what you'll find at the coordinates, should be enough to expose Meridian and stop the deployment of a weapon that could destabilize the entire world. Be careful, be smart, and know that I believed in you even when I couldn't say it in person. George." I blinked back unexpected tears. George had been watching me from afar all these years, silently evaluating whether I could be trusted with his life's most important work. Despite our limited personal interaction, he had seen something in me worth betting everything on. After carefully repacking the items, I signaled Ms. Peterman that I was finished. Back outside, I found Emily waiting anxiously at a coffee shop across the street. "We need to get to Lake Ontario," I told her, showing her the compass and explaining what I'd found. "This will lead us to Meridian's secret testing facility, the same place they're likely planning their demonstration." Emily studied the compass with interest. "This is incredibly sophisticated work. Your uncle must have spent months designing and calibrating this." "George was always meticulous," I said. "Even when I was a kid, he insisted that anything worth doing was worth doing with absolute precision." We returned to our hotel to gather our belongings and plan our approach to the coordinates. According to the map, the location was about 60 miles northeast, in a remote area along Lake Ontario's southern shore. The site appeared to be an abandoned industrial complex surrounded by forest, accessible only by a single private road. As Emily plotted our route, my phone rang, an unknown number with a local area code. I answered cautiously. Alex Morgan? The voice was male, unfamiliar, and tense. Who's asking? My name is David Winters. Robert Winters is my father. I put the phone on a speaker so Emily could hear. What do you want? To warn you. My father called me this morning. He doesn't have much time. Meridian is holding him at their facility near the lake. They forced him to contact you by threatening my family. Now they're planning to eliminate him since he served his purpose. Why should I believe you? I asked, though something in his voice rang true. Because my father also told me to tell you that the oak tree wasn't just about coordinates. It was about standing firm against the storm. He said you'd understand. The phrase sent a jolt through me. It was exactly the kind of thing George would have said, and not something Meridian would have invented as bait. I'm listening, and I said, the demonstration is scheduled for tomorrow at noon. They're bringing in potential buyers from multiple countries. My father believes they're planning to showcase the weapon's capabilities by targeting an abandoned ship they have anchored offshore. The energy discharge will be calibrated to destroy the ship completely while leaving minimal evidence. Why are you telling us this? Because my father made a mistake getting involved with Meridian, but he's trying to make it right. He wanted me to tell you there's a service tunnel leading into the facility from the lakeside. It was built as an emergency evacuation route, but doesn't appear on the current security protocols. You can use it to access the main testing area undetected. David gave us precise directions to the tunnel entrance before ending the call with a final plea. If you can, please help my father. He may have been compromised, but he's not a willing participant in what Meridian is doing. Emily looked skeptical. It could be a trap. It could be Rivera. I agreed. But that phrase about the oak tree, that's exactly the kind of thing George would have said to me. And it connects to the memory I used to access the laptop. Even if David Winters is telling the truth, his father might not be. Robert could be feeding him information Meridian wants us to have. Well, a true hippo, I acknowledged. But what choice do we have? The demonstration is tomorrow. We're running out of time to stop it. We decided to proceed to the coordinates, but with extreme caution, planning to verify David's information about the service tunnel before committing to using it. I contacted Dr. Rivera to update him and asked him to alert his contacts if we didn't check in by the following evening. The drive to Lake Ontario took us through increasingly rural landscapes, small towns giving way to farmland, and eventually the dense forest that bordered the lake. Following both traditional GPS and George's specialized compass, we turned onto progressively smaller roads until we reached what appeared to be an abandoned logging trail. We should continue on foot from here, Emily suggested. Less chance of being detected. We parked the car in a concealed spot and gathered essential equipment, flashlights, the compass, a small toolkit, and the smartphone containing copies of the facility schematics from the USB drive. According to the map, we were approximately 2 miles from the coordinates, with dense forest providing cover for our approach. The specialized compass proved its worth immediately. Unlike a standard compass, its needle remained steady despite local magnetic variations that would normally cause deflection. As we hiked through the woods, I couldn't help but admire George's foresight and technical ingenuity. After about an hour of careful progress, we reached a ridge overlooking a wide clearing. Below us stood what appeared from a distance to be an abandoned industrial complex, warehouses, a small dock extending into the lake, and perimeter fencing that had been allowed to rust and sag in places. But as we observed through binoculars, the illusion of abandonment was revealed as careful camouflage. Guard patrols moved along precise routes. Security cameras were disguised as broken fixtures or nesting boxes. And despite the weathered exterior, we could see signs of modern technology, subtle but unmistakable to trained eyes. State-of-the-art security dressed up to look derelict, Emily murmured. Classic misdirection. We circled around to the lakeside, staying within the tree line for cover. According to David Winters' information, the service tunnel entrance should be located near the water, disguised as an old drainage outlet. It took nearly 30 minutes of careful searching before we found it. A concrete culvert partially submerged in the lake, appearing to be nothing more than a storm drain. But when I examined it more closely, I discovered that the grating, which seemed to be rusted solid, actually moved on well-oiled hinges when pressed in a specific sequence. David's information checks out so far, I said, cautiously pulling the grate open to reveal a narrow tunnel sloping gently upward. This hasn't been abandoned at all. It's been maintained and kept operational while appearing derelict. Which means the rest of his information might be accurate too, Emily concluded, including the timing of the demonstration tomorrow. We consulted the schematics on the phone. If David's information was correct, this tunnel would lead us directly to a maintenance area one level below the main testing facility. From there, we could potentially access the control room where the demonstration would be coordinated. We should wait until dark, Emily said. Better visibility differential for us. Their eyes will be adjusted to the indoor lighting, making it harder for them to spot us coming from the dark tunnel. I agreed, and we retreated to a concealed position to wait for nightfall. As the sun began its descent, we discussed our plan. The primary objective was to gather definitive evidence of the weapon and the planned demonstration, then transmit that evidence to Dr. Rivera before Meridian could stop us. If we're lucky, we might also find your uncle's final cache, Emily added, the one marked checkmate on his map. You think it's inside the facility? I asked, surprised. It would be the perfect place to hide something Meridian would never think to look for, right under their noses. If George managed to access this place as he indicated in his notes, he might have left his most damning evidence where it would do the most harm if discovered. The strategy made a certain poetic sense, exactly the kind of ironic justice George might have appreciated. As darkness fell, we prepared to enter the tunnel. The night vision equipment borrowed from the university would give us an advantage in the dark passage. Before we moved, I sent Dr. Rivera a message with our exact coordinates and a brief summary of our plan. Insurance in case something went wrong. The tunnel was narrow and damp, requiring us to proceed in a half-crouch. Water trickled along the bottom, making our progress slippery, but also masking any sounds we might make. According to the schematics, the passage extended approximately 400 yards before reaching a maintenance access door. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached the door, a heavy metal barrier that looked formidable but, according to the schematics, operated on a simple mechanical locking system rather than electronic security. This made sense for an emergency evacuation route that needed to function even during power failures. Using tools from the kit, I carefully manipulated the lock mechanism until it released with a satisfying click. Emily and I exchanged glances, then slowly eased the door open, prepared to retreat instantly if we encountered guards. The space beyond was dark and quiet, a storage room filled with maintenance equipment and spare parts. A single emergency light cast a red glow over the scene, providing just enough illumination to navigate by. We switched off our night vision equipment, allowing our eyes to adjust to the dim lighting. According to the schematics, we were now on the lowest level of the facility, with access to utility corridors that ran beneath the main operational areas. Our destination, the control room overlooking the testing chamber, was 2 levels up. We moved cautiously through the maintenance level, following the schematics and avoiding the few areas marked as having regular staff presence even at night. The facility was clearly operating with minimal personnel during overnight hours, a stroke of luck for our infiltration. Reaching a service elevator, we decided against using it despite the convenience it offered. Instead, we located a maintenance ladder that provided access to the higher levels through utility shafts. The climb was strenuous but safer than risking the noise and potential surveillance of the elevator. Emerging on the main level, we immediately noticed the increased security presence. Guards patrolled at regular intervals, and surveillance cameras covered most major corridors. Using the schematics to identify blind spots and timing the guard rotations, we advanced slowly toward the control room area. As we approached our destination, the sound of voices made us freeze. 2 technicians emerged from a doorway ahead, engrossed in conversation about system calibrations for tomorrow's demonstration. We pressed ourselves into a recessed doorway until they passed, catching fragments of their discussion. Blackwood wants the yield at 60% for the demonstration, nothing higher. Overkill for a target that size, but the buyers want a spectacle. Once they were gone, we continued forward with even greater caution. The control room would likely be staffed even at night, especially with a major demonstration scheduled for the following day. Direct access might be impossible without detection. There, Emily whispered, pointing to a door marked Observation Deck B. According to the schematics, that should give us a view of both the control room and the testing chamber without having to enter either directly. The door was locked with a keycard system, but the schematics showed an override protocol designed for emergency access. Using the specialized tools George had included with the USB drive, I bypassed the electronic lock. The door opened with a soft hiss of hydraulics. Beyond lay a darkened observation gallery overlooking an enormous chamber below. The testing facility was far larger than I had imagined, a cavernous space with a massive apparatus at its center. The device looked like nothing I'd ever seen before, a complex arrangement of components surrounding what appeared to be a central energy focusing array. On the far side of the chamber, through a glass wall, we could see the illuminated control room where technicians monitored various systems. Massive display screens showed diagnostic information, energy calculations, and what appeared to be targeting parameters. "That's it," Emily whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "The M system. My father died trying to prevent this from being weaponized." I took out my phone and began taking photographs of the device and the control room displays, making sure to capture the targeting information that proved the system's intended use. As I documented everything, Emily explored the observation deck, checking for any additional information we could use. "Alex," she called softly, urgency in her voice. "Look at this." In a locked cabinet at the rear of the observation deck, visible through a small glass panel, was a metal box marked with a distinctive symbol. The same symbol that had appeared on George's map next to the designation Checkmate. "It's the final cache," I breathed, hardly daring to believe our luck. George really did hide it right under their noses. The cabinet had a complex electronic lock, more sophisticated than the door's security. It took several tense minutes to bypass, during which I feared our presence would be discovered with each passing second. Finally, the lock disengaged, and we retrieved the metal box. Inside was a single item, a small data storage device unlike any I'd seen before, custom-built with military-grade protection. A note in George's handwriting accompanied it. "The final piece. This contains complete operational data from Meridian's own systems, which I extracted during my covert visits to this facility. It includes test firing records, internal communications acknowledging the illegal nature of the program, and direct orders from Meridian leadership to proceed despite legal prohibitions. Most importantly, it contains the complete technical specifications for the M system, including critical vulnerabilities intentionally left undocumented in their official records." GW. "This is it," Emily said. "The smoking gun. With this and the evidence we've already collected, we can prove everything." We had just secured the device when an alarm suddenly blared throughout the facility. Red warning lights began flashing in the corridors outside. "Security breach in Sector 7, announced an automated voice over the PA system. "All personnel implement lockdown procedures." "Sector 7, that's not us," Emily said, quickly consulting the schematics. "We're in Sector 4. Someone else has triggered the alarm." "Or it's a diversion," I suggested. "Either way, we need to move now while they're focused elsewhere." We exited the observation deck and headed toward our planned escape route, moving more quickly now that stealth was compromised by the facility-wide alert. Guards ran past intersecting corridors, heading toward the reported breach and paying no attention to our section of the building. As we approached the maintenance access that would lead us back to the emergency tunnel, a figure stepped out from a side passage, blocking our path. Robert Winters stood before us, looking haggard and tense but determined. "You made it," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd figure it out in time." "You triggered the alarm," I realized. "You're creating a diversion for us." Winters nodded. "It's the least I could do after being forced to betray George's trust. They've been holding my grandson hostage, diabetic, needs regular medication. They threatened to withhold it unless I cooperated." "Your son contacted us," Emily said. "David's a good man, better than his father." Winters checked his watch. "You have about 3 minutes before they realize the breach is a false alarm. The tunnel exit is your best chance, but they'll have patrols checking all potential escape routes soon. Come with us." I offered. Winters shook his head. Someone needs to maintain the diversion. Besides, I have unfinished business here. He pressed a small device into my hand. George and I developed this years ago, a targeted EMP that can temporarily disable the M system's primary control circuits. It won't destroy the device, but it will prevent tomorrow's demonstration from proceeding as planned. They'll kill you when they realize what you've done, Emily warned. Probably, Winters agreed, but some debts can only be paid one way. Now go, finish what George started. With a final nod of respect, Winters turned and headed deeper into the facility. We continued to the maintenance access, descending rapidly to the lower level and making our way back to the emergency tunnel. The alarm continued to sound as we reached the tunnel entrance. Just as we were about to enter, shouting voices approached from behind. Guards had discovered our escape route. There was no time for subtlety now. We plunged into the dark passage, running as fast as the narrow confines would allow. Behind us, flashlight beams cut through the darkness as the guards entered the tunnel in pursuit. The sound of their boots splashing through the shallow water echoed off the concrete walls. They were gaining on us. Ahead, I could see the faint outline of the exit grate. Freedom was tantalizingly close, but our pursuers were closing the gap. As we reached the exit, I fumbled with the mechanism, trying to remember the precise sequence needed to open it from the inside. "Hurry!" Emily urged, glancing back at the approaching lights. The grate finally swung open, and we emerged into the cold night air beside the lake. Without pausing, we sprinted for the cover of the nearby trees, the shouts of the guards growing louder behind us. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from my head. We ducked lower and ran in a zigzag pattern, making it harder for them to aim in the darkness. More shots followed, but they were firing blind now, unable to track us precisely in the dense forest. We ran until our lungs burned, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the facility. When we finally paused to catch our breath, the sounds of pursuit had faded. They had either given up the chase or spread out to search more methodically. "We need to get back to the car," I gasped, checking that the precious data device was still secure in my pocket. "And then straight to the border," Emily added. "We need to get this evidence into safe hands before Meridian can stop us." As we oriented ourselves using George's compass, a distant boom shook the ground beneath our feet. We turned to see a bright flash illuminate the night sky over the facility, followed by secondary explosions. "Winters," Emily said softly. "He didn't just disable the system. He destroyed it." The sacrifice was clear. Robert Winters had given his life to atone for his betrayal, ensuring that the weapon could not be demonstrated or deployed while we escaped with the evidence. With renewed determination, we made our way back to the car, our mission now more urgent than ever. We had the evidence George had spent decades collecting. We had the final piece that proved Meridian's illegal weapons program, and we had a debt to pay to those who had sacrificed everything to bring the truth to light. As we drove toward the border, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From reluctant heir to a seemingly worthless farm, to the carrier of a legacy far more important than land or money. George had trusted me with his life's most important work, and I would not let him down. The battle wasn't over. Meridian still had resources and influence that would make them dangerous enemies. But for the first time since discovering the hidden money in that old tractor, I felt certain we would prevail. The truth George had protected for so long would finally come to light, and those responsible would face justice at last. Crossing the Canadian border proved easier than expected. With Meridian's facility in chaos following the explosion, they hadn't yet mobilized resources to intercept us at border checkpoints. We passed through with our regular identification, the precious data device, and evidence hidden carefully among our belongings. Once safely in Canadian territory, we contacted Dr. Rivera using a secure communication app he had installed on my phone before we left Pittsburgh. "You made it," he said, relief evident in his voice. "We've been monitoring news reports about an explosion at an industrial site near Lake Ontario. I'm assuming you know something about that." "Robert Winters sacrificed himself to destroy the weapon and create a diversion for our escape," I explained. "We found George's final cache, the checkmate he marked on his map. It's a data storage device containing everything we need to expose Meridian." "Where are you headed now?" Rivera asked. "Toronto," Emily answered. We need to get this evidence to people who can act on it immediately. My father had a contact at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service who helped him years ago. I'm hoping the connection still exists. Be careful, Rivera cautioned. Meridian will recover quickly from this setback. They have too much invested in the M system to simply give up, and their connections extend into multiple governments, including Canada's. We'll contact you once we've delivered the evidence, I promised before ending the call. The drive to Toronto took several hours, during which Emily and I remained vigilant for any sign of pursuit. Dawn was breaking as we reached the city, painting the skyline in soft pinks and golds that belied the danger we still faced. Emily directed me to a modest hotel in a residential neighborhood, away from the downtown core where surveillance cameras were more prevalent. After checking in under false names, we took a few hours to rest and regroup, knowing the next phase of our mission would require clear thinking and careful planning. In the relative safety of our hotel room, I connected George's data device to my laptop. It required a password, but using the clue "Remember the Oak Tree" again proved successful. The device contained a treasure trove of information, thousands of internal Meridian documents, test firing records, communications between executives, and detailed technical specifications for the M system. Most damning were video recordings of conversations between Edward Blackwood, Meridian's current CEO, and various government officials, discussing how to keep the weapons program hidden from oversight committees and international inspectors. The evidence was comprehensive and irrefutable. George really did think of everything, Emily said as we reviewed the files. He built a case so complete that not even Meridian's government connections could make it disappear. But we still need to get it to the right people, I reminded her. People who won't be influenced by Meridian's reach. Emily nodded, pulling out her phone. My father's contact at CSIS was named William Chen. I don't know if he's still active, but it's our best starting point. After several calls and careful vetting by intelligence officials, we received instructions to meet a CSIS agent at a public library in downtown Toronto. The meeting was set for noon, just 3 hours away. We spent those hours organizing the evidence, creating backups, and encrypting copies that could be transmitted to multiple destinations simultaneously if necessary. If Meridian somehow intercepted us before the meeting, the evidence would still reach the authorities. At 11:30, we left the hotel and took a circuitous route to the library, watching carefully for any sign of surveillance. The Toronto Reference Library was busy with students and researchers, providing excellent cover for our meeting. We found a quiet study area on the third floor as instructed and waited. At precisely noon, a middle-aged Asian man in a gray suit approached our table. I believe you have some overdue books to return, he said casually, using the prearranged phrase. Yes, they've been checked out far too long, Emily responded with the countersign. The man nodded slightly. William Chen sends his regards. He retired 5 years ago, but he remembered your father fondly. He sat down across from us, his manner professional but not unfriendly. My name is Agent Patel. I understand you have evidence regarding Meridian Defense? We briefed him on the situation, explaining George's decades-long mission to expose Meridian's illegal weapons program and how we had recovered the final pieces of evidence. Agent Patel listened intently, his expression growing more serious as he realized the magnitude of what we were describing. If this evidence is verified, it represents one of the most significant breaches of international weapons treaties in decades, he said finally. Multiple agencies will need to coordinate a response, and Meridian's political connections will complicate matters considerably. That's why we came to you first, Emily explained. We need protection while the evidence is verified, and we need assurance that it won't be buried by those same political connections. I can arrange protective custody, Agent Patel confirmed, but the evidence needs to be secured immediately. Once Meridian realizes what you've taken, they'll use every resource at their disposal to recover or discredit it. We handed over the primary data device and a backup drive containing all the files we'd reviewed. Agent Patel carefully secured them in a specialized container designed to prevent electronic tampering or remote wiping. What happens now? I asked. You'll be taken to a secure location while we authenticate the evidence and brief the appropriate authorities. Given the international implications, both U.S. and Canadian intelligence services will be involved, along with representatives from international regulatory bodies. Agent Patel made a discreet call, and within minutes, 2 additional agents joined us. They escorted us from the library through a service exit where an unmarked vehicle waited. The efficiency of the operation was both reassuring and slightly unnerving, a reminder that we had entered a world of professional intelligence work far removed from my former life as an engineer. We were driven to a nondescript government building in a commercial district of Toronto. Inside, the bland exterior gave way to a high-security facility with multiple checkpoints and armed guards. Agent Patel led us to a conference room where several other officials waited, including an older man who introduced himself as Deputy Director Harris of the CSIS. "We've initiated preliminary verification of your evidence," Harris informed us. "Our technical analysts confirm that the data signatures appear authentic and show no signs of tampering. We're proceeding on the assumption that everything you've provided is legitimate." "How long before you can act on it?" Emily asked. "We've already begun coordinating with U.S. intelligence services and Interpol," Harris replied. "Arrest warrants are being prepared for key Meridian executives, including Edward Blackwood. The challenge will be executing them simultaneously to prevent any from escaping jurisdiction." For the next several hours, Emily and I provided detailed statements explaining how we had discovered George's hidden caches, what each contained, and how we had infiltrated Meridian's secret facility. The officials were particularly interested in the specialized compass George had created and the custom data storage device that had remained hidden in plain sight within the facility for years. "Your uncle was a remarkable man," Deputy Director Harris told me. "To maintain this level of covert activity while under surveillance for decades, it's unprecedented for a civilian." "He wasn't just doing it for himself," I said. "He was completing a mission that had cost his friend, Emily's father, his life. He couldn't let that sacrifice be in vain." As evening approached, Agent Patel returned to the conference room with news. "We've received confirmation that the FBI has executed search warrants at Meridian's headquarters in Virginia. Edward Blackwood was taken into custody 30 minutes ago, along with 5 other executives. Simultaneous operations are targeting Meridian facilities in 3 other states." This was the moment we had been working toward, the culmination of George's decades-long mission and our days of danger and discovery. Justice was finally in motion, but my relief was tempered by a sudden realization. "What about the farm?" I asked. "There could still be evidence there that Meridian's people might try to destroy." "We've already dispatched agents to secure the property," Harris assured me, "and local law enforcement has been advised to cooperate fully." "Sheriff Reynolds is compromised," I warned. "She's been working for Meridian for years." "We're aware," Harris nodded. "She was taken into custody this morning on charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Her involvement actually helped build the case against Meridian, providing evidence of how deeply they had infiltrated local authorities." As night fell, we were moved to a secure residential facility, essentially a safe house where we would remain until the immediate threat from Meridian had been neutralized. The apartment was comfortable but clearly designed for security, with reinforced doors, surveillance equipment, and no windows facing the street. Agent Patel remained as our primary contact, bringing regular updates on the expanding investigation. The evidence George had collected was proving even more significant than initially thought, revealing a network of corruption that extended into multiple government agencies and foreign entities. "The fallout from this will continue for years," Patel explained over breakfast the following morning. "We've already identified 3 additional defense contractors involved in similar prohibited weapons research, all connected to Meridian through shell companies and shared personnel." "What about Frank Miller?" I asked, remembering the neighbor who had been so eager to acquire George's worthless tractor and the land it sat on. "Miller was picked up yesterday," Patel confirmed. "He's facing charges of conspiracy and attempted theft. According to his statement, he had been approached by Meridian representatives years ago who offered him a substantial finder's fee for any evidence he could recover from your uncle's property. He claims he didn't know the full scope of what they were looking for, just that there was something valuable hidden there." 3 days after our arrival at the safe house, Deputy Director Harris himself came to brief us on developments too sensitive to discuss over normal communication channels. The technical specifications recovered from George's evidence have led to the identification of 3 operational M-system prototypes at various stages of development, he explained. 2 were located in secure facilities within the United States, one in an underground installation in Nevada, and another at a maritime testing range off the coast of Maine. The third was discovered at a private island facility in Southeast Asia, apparently being prepared for delivery to an international buyer. Have they been secured? Emily asked urgently. The U.S. installations are under military control now, Harris confirmed. The international site was raided by a joint task force yesterday. All prototype systems have been contained. This was better news than we could have hoped for. Not only was Meridian being held accountable, but the dangerous technology they had developed was being secured before it could proliferate globally. There's one more thing you should know, Harris added, his expression growing more solemn. During the raid on Meridian's headquarters, our counterparts discovered documents indicating that George Wilson's death may not have been from natural causes as originally reported. A cold weight settled in my stomach. They killed him? The evidence suggests he was poisoned, gradually over time, with a substance designed to mimic the symptoms of natural deterioration due to age. They likely suspected he had gathered evidence against them, but couldn't locate it all, so they eliminated him hoping his secrets would die with him. But they didn't count on him leaving the farm to me, I said quietly. Exactly. From what we can piece together, George realized what was happening to him. That's why he accelerated his plans, creating the final pieces of the puzzle and ensuring they would lead to you. He knew his time was running out. The revelation that George had been murdered filled me with renewed anger toward Meridian, but also deepened my respect for my great-uncle's foresight and courage. Even as they were killing him, he had been setting the stage for their ultimate exposure and downfall. By the end of the week, the immediate security concerns had diminished enough that we were allowed to return to the United States under protective escort. The media was now reporting extensively on the Meridian scandal, though many details remained classified. The public narrative focused on corporate corruption and illegal weapons development, with appropriate redactions to protect national security interests. Our first stop upon returning was Pittsburgh, where Dr. Rivera, Professor Kaminsky, and Layla had been debriefed by federal agents but otherwise allowed to continue their normal activities. The reunion was emotional, with genuine relief that our dangerous mission had succeeded. The university has been inundated with media inquiries, Rivera told us over dinner at his home. I've declined all interviews, of course, but the president has received calls from multiple government agencies expressing appreciation for our assistance. What happens to the technology now? Layla asked, the question we had all been wondering. From what we've been told, the offensive weapons applications are being dismantled, Emily explained, but the underlying energy generation technology is being preserved for further research under international oversight. My father and George always believed it could benefit humanity if developed ethically. The following day, we made the journey back to George's farm. My farm now, though it felt different returning to it with the full knowledge of its significance. Federal agents had completed their examination of the property, securing all remaining evidence while leaving the buildings and land intact. Susan was waiting for us on the porch, her face breaking into a wide smile as we approached. She embraced us both warmly, tears in her eyes. George would be so proud, she said, stepping back to look at us. He always said the right person would finish what he started. He was right about you, Alex. The farm itself showed signs of the intensive search that had occurred. Disturbed earth where Meridian's operatives had dug for hidden caches, doors left ajar, furniture moved. But the essence of the place remained, that sense of peace and purpose that had struck me on my first visit. What will you do with it now? Emily asked as we walked the property, passing the old John Deere tractor that had started this entire journey. I ran my hand along the tractor's faded green hood, remembering the excitement of discovering that first hidden cache in the fuel tank. I think I'll restore it, both the tractor and the farm. Create something meaningful from what George left behind. In the days that followed, I began to formulate a more concrete plan for the property. The farmhouse would be renovated, preserving its historical character while updating its systems for modern efficiency. The barn would be transformed into a workshop and educational space where I could apply my engineering skills to developing sustainable agricultural technologies. Susan agreed to stay on, not just as a housekeeper, but as a partner in the farm's new purpose. Her knowledge of the property and her dedication to George's vision made her an invaluable ally in planning its future. Emily remained in close contact, dividing her time between Toronto, where she was assisting with the ongoing investigation, and the farm. Our shared experience had created a bond that neither of us had anticipated, but both valued deeply. 1 month after our return, we hosted a small, private memorial service for George at the farm. Dr. Rivera and Professor Kaminsky attended, along with several government officials who had been involved in the case, and David Winters, who came to honor both George and his father's final act of redemption. As we gathered under the great oak tree where the tractor had once stood, now restored and housed in the rebuilt barn, I shared memories of the man I had barely known, but whose legacy had changed my life completely. George Wilson wasn't just my great uncle, I told the assembled group. He was a visionary who recognized that technological progress without ethical guardrails could lead to catastrophe. He sacrificed his career, his reputation, and ultimately his life to protect the world from a weapon that should never have been created. But he also preserved the potential for that same technology to someday benefit humanity, if developed with wisdom and restraint. After the ceremony, as guests departed, Emily and I remained by the oak tree, looking out over the fields that stretched toward the horizon. "Have you decided what to do with the money?" she asked. The question referred to the substantial funds recovered from George's various hiding places around the property. Nearly $500,000 in payment, gold, and collectible currency. The government had verified its legitimacy, and finding no connection to illegal activities on George's part, had released it to me as part of my inheritance. "I'm establishing a scholarship fund in George's name," I explained, "for engineering students who demonstrate a commitment to ethical technology development. And I'm using part of it to fund a small research foundation that will collaborate with Professor Kaminsky on exploring the beneficial applications of the M-System's energy generation principles." Emily nodded approvingly. A fitting tribute, using Meridian's own funds to ensure the technology they tried to weaponize will help people instead. As evening approached, casting long shadows across the renewed farm, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing from my life before inheriting this place. The unemployed engineer with mounting debt and diminishing prospects had found not just financial security, but purpose, a mission that honored the past while creating something valuable for the future. The old John Deere tractor now sat gleaming in its restored glory inside the barn, a reminder of how this journey had begun. I had kept the small metal piece George had given me as a child, mounting it in a simple frame alongside a photograph of him standing proudly beside the tractor in its prime. Below it, I'd inscribed his words that had proven so prophetic. "The real value of things isn't always visible on the surface." 6 months after the raid on Meridian's facility, the criminal trials began for Edward Blackwood and the other executives involved in the illegal weapons program. Emily and I were called to testify about our discovery of George's evidence and our infiltration of the secret testing facility. The proceedings were partly closed to the public due to national security concerns, but enough was made public to ensure accountability. Blackwood was ultimately sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for violations of international weapons treaties, conspiracy, corporate espionage, and the murder of George Wilson and James Parker. Other executives received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Sheriff Reynolds pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for her testimony against Meridian, receiving 5 years probation and community service. The technology itself remained under international supervision, with research into its energy generation applications proceeding cautiously under the oversight of a multinational scientific committee. Professor Kaminsky was invited to join this committee, bringing his ethical perspective and technical expertise to ensure the technology would be developed responsibly. 1 year after inheriting the farm, I stood in the newly renovated workshop, surrounded by engineering students from the local university who had come for a weekend seminar on sustainable agricultural technology. The workshop was now equipped with modern tools alongside carefully preserved antique equipment, bridging past and present, just as George would have appreciated. Through the window, I could see Emily leading another group through the demonstration garden, explaining the integrated systems we had developed for water conservation and solar energy collection. Her expertise in environmental science complemented my engineering background perfectly, creating a partnership that extended beyond the farm to joint lectures and consulting work with communities interested in sustainable development. Susan appeared at the workshop door, a knowing smile on her face. "There's someone here to see you," she said, "a special visitor." Curious, I excused myself from the students and followed her to the farmhouse. On the porch stood Dr. Rivera, looking pleased with himself. "I have something for you," he said, handing me a small package. It arrived at my office yesterday with instructions to deliver it personally. Inside the package was a simple wooden box containing an old pocket watch and a handwritten note. The watch had belonged to George's father, passed down through generations. The note was in George's handwriting, though clearly written some time ago. "To whomever completes the mission, this watch belonged to my father, who taught me that time reveals all truths eventually, if one has the patience to wait and the courage to act when the moment comes. You have proven yourself worthy of that legacy. May it remind you that some inheritances carry more than material value. They carry responsibility, purpose, and the chance to make a difference that outlasts our brief time on this earth." The postmark on the outer package showed it had been mailed 3 years earlier, with instructions for delivery 1 year after George's death, regardless of whether his mission had been completed. He had faith that someone would follow the trail he left, but had planned for the possibility of failure as well, ensuring the watch would go to whoever had tried, successful or not. I fastened the watch around my wrist, feeling the weight of its history and meaning. Through the window, I could see the students exploring the farm, asking questions, taking notes, absorbing the lessons of sustainable technology and ethical innovation that were now the property's primary purpose. The worthless tractor had led to the discovery of not just hidden money, but a hidden mission, one that had exposed corruption, prevented a dangerous weapons system from proliferating, and transformed a neglected farm into a center for positive change. George's true legacy wasn't the land or the money he'd left behind, but the example he'd set of standing firm against powerful interests when principles were at stake. As I rejoined the students in the workshop, I caught Emily's eye through the window and shared a smile of quiet understanding. We had both lost fathers whose principles had cost them dearly, but whose courage had ultimately prevailed through those who carried on their work. Some inheritances couldn't be measured in acres or dollars. Some legacies weren't written in wills, but in the choices we make and the values we uphold when faced with difficult truths. And sometimes what appears worthless on the surface conceals the most valuable treasure of all, a purpose worth fighting for.